Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hope you've checked out my website so far, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and they're just an incredible wealth of information on my websites. Literally thousands of articles. There are a multitude of books. There are DVDs. There are links to my YouTube videos. I produce YouTube videos 5 days, normally 5 days a week. And all of that information is absolutely free to you. Now, I do want to remind you of the very special offer that I'm making to you, my NowTV audience. Okay? We've been studying over the last several weeks the coming of the Lord in the glory of the Father. I wrote a book entitled, Like Father, Like Son, on Clouds of Glory. This book develops extensively the material that I've been sharing with you on this program about what it meant for Jesus to say that he was coming in judgment in the first century in the glory of the Father. That it meant that he was going to come as the Father had come, just like he said in John chapter 5, 21 and following, when he said, "From henceforth the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all men might honor the Son as they honor the Father. The Son can do nothing of himself, but what he has seen the Father do, he will do likewise." So here is Jesus' very clear, very emphatic teaching that he was going to come in judgment in the same way he had seen the Father come. Now, I think it ought to be really clear. It is really undeniable. Jesus had never seen his Father literally, visibly, bodily come out of heaven riding on a literal cloud. I mean, he had never seen his Father come and destroy the literal, physical heaven and earth. He had never seen his Father come in flaming fire with a literal shout at all. But he had seen his Father act in judgment by utilizing one nation to judge another nation. And in utilizing, through his sovereignty, one nation to judge another, it was said that the nations saw him. It was said he came down, as I demonstrated in last week's program. It was said that he came on the clouds with the angels in power and glory. And then there is this absolutely remarkable comment and statement found throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Tanakh. In passage after passage in which Yahweh said he was going to come, in which he was going to use this nation to judge that nation, okay? He said that when that was done, when he used this nation to judge that nation, it was said that he was going to do that they may know that I am God. In other words, when one of Yahweh's prophets, pardon me, when Isaiah or Jeremiah or Nahum or Haggai or Micah or Zechariah or whatever, when one of Yahweh's prophets said, okay, judgment on Babylon is at hand, and the Assyrians will do it. Then when the nations who had heard those predictions could see that the Assyrians destroyed the Babylonians, then they could know that Yahweh is truly God. And thus the challenge of Yahweh to the nations is essentially the same challenge that Jesus gives you and me. You remember what the challenge of Christ is? You know, that's what I've been sharing with you over these last several weeks. what is the challenge of Christ? Jesus, surrounded by his enemies. Oh, by the way, I've just got to take a little sidebar here. It's absolutely amazing to me that, unfortunately, many people, good people without a doubt, but when many people are confronted by the enemies of Christianity, enemies who say, show us the proof of Jesus. I had one debate opponent when I repeatedly challenged him, provide your proper exegesis of the passages to support what you are saying. He got up and he said, I don't need exegesis, all I need is Jesus. Hey, look, folks, I'm sorry, that doesn't answer anything. That doesn't answer the challenge of Jesus. That doesn't answer the challenge of the Muslims and the Jews and the atheists who say, your Jesus made a false prediction. He said he was coming back in the first century. He didn't do it. He's a false prophet. He's a liar. And I want to tell you something. When we're confronted with that challenge, and if we just simply stand up and we say, hey, look, I don't have to give you any proof. I don't have to prove anything. I just know it's true. We're not going to convert anybody. We're not going to convert a single Jew, Muslim, or atheist. I have to share this with you very quickly. Some years ago, right here in Ardmore, I was doing some door knocking, talking to people. And I knocked on the door of one individual. He was an atheist, as it turns out. And he and I had this fantastic discussion. How do I express this? He was an angry atheist. And what I mean by that, he conveyed to me the idea that he couldn't trust the Bible, he couldn't believe in God, he couldn't believe in Jesus, and he was a little bit upset about that. But he had bought into the false narrative that Jesus failed, that Jesus lied. He had accepted the Muslim, Jew, and atheist claims that the New Testament is not inspired, can't be trusted. But as I stood there on that gentleman's porch and I met the challenge of Jesus, and I presented the evidence for the fulfillment of Jesus' words, he went from being an angry atheist to a man who ultimately said, I don't have any answers for what you're saying. I can see that what you're saying is true, but it destroys my atheism. I don't know whatever became of that man. I really don't. But at least he had the intellectual honesty to admit that his objections to Jesus and the Bible had now been met, because I had presented to him Jesus' own words. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me to do, do not believe me. He thought that he could prove that Jesus failed. He thought that he could prove the New Testament was uninspired. When I demonstrated from Scripture the things that I've been sharing with you on this program, he acknowledged he had no answers whatsoever. I certainly hope and pray the man recovered his faith in Jesus and the integrity of Scripture. I just don't know. I never saw him, never heard from him again. But you see, we have to come to grips with this challenge of Jesus, as I've been sharing with you over and over on this program. And as I understand, look, I understand that I'm saying the same thing over and over to a good extent. Yes, I understand that. But you know, they say the key to learning is what? Repetition, repetition, repetition. So what I'm doing is not simply repeating the same thing, although I am doing that, but what I'm doing is showing you that there is a comprehensive, vast array of evidence that supports what I'm saying about the challenge of Jesus and about the definition of Christ's coming. And I want to drive this point home. Unless and until you and I become more familiar with the Old Testament background, the Old Testament source for all of the New Testament predictions of the day of the Lord. And as long as we impose a Grecian, literalistic worldview, a view of literature, by the way, on the New Testament text, completely divorced from the Old Testament, we are not going to understand the New Testament. Some years ago, in one of my books, I've written now 31 books. You can find them all listed on my website, DonPreston.com. But some years ago, in one of my books, I made the comment, there are no new eschatological promises found in the New Testament. Every New Testament writer tells us, either explicitly or implicitly, that their eschatological hope was nothing but God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And thus, when Peter talked about the restoration of all things, Acts chapter 3, what did he say? It was the restoration of all things promised by Moses, Samuel, yea, and all of the prophets who have ever spoken. Well, who are those prophets? They're Old Covenant prophets. When Paul said that his hope of the resurrection was nothing but what Moses and the prophets said would happen, Acts 26, 21 and following, well, who's Moses and all the prophets? Old Testament prophets. And so, again, my point is, the reason that I'm going to all of these Old Testament prophecies to illustrate what Jesus meant when he said he was going to come in the glory of the Father is to reveal and to share with you that the Old Testament reveals to us how God had come, how the Father had come on clouds of glory many times in the Old Testament, and to demonstrate over and over again the nature of Hebraic apocalyptic language. Now, there's a mouthful, I understand that, but Hebraic apocalyptic language is language that sounds like heaven and earth are going to be destroyed. It sounds like the entire material cosmos is going to be dismantled. And it sounds like God was coming out of heaven, riding on a cloud, with a shout, with the angels, and in flaming fire. It's what it sounds like. I agree. I admit that. But you see, when it can be demonstrated, as I have, that that language cannot be taken literally at all, then that forces us to see that this language, now here's what I want you to catch, okay, as we get ready to go into another text that helps us define the day of the Lord. When we have this entire Old Testament background, when we have this entire database of Old Testament language concerning the day of the Lord, concerning the coming of the Lord out of heaven on the clouds with the angels in flaming fire to destroy heaven and earth, and when all of that language is demonstrably metaphoric, here's the question I want you to ponder. When the New Testament writers all say that they were expecting the day of the Lord foretold by the Old Testament, and when that Old Testament consistently, persistently, without exception, used the language of the coming of the Lord out of heaven on the clouds with the angels in flaming fire to destroy heaven and earth, and they use that language metaphorically, then upon what basis do we come to the New Testament And we see that the New Testament, for instance, 2 Peter chapter 3, a passage that we will deal with extensively later on. We come to 2 Peter chapter 3, and we realize that Peter, by his own comments, is quoting from the Old Testament. He is quoting from passages that are demonstrably metaphoric. Upon what basis, then, do we say, well, yeah, the Old Testament language is metaphoric. It was never intended to be taken literally, but Peter is using it literally to predict the end of time. Some years ago, I attended a lectureship at the Frida Hardeman University in Henderson, Tennessee. And there was a well-noted professor there from Harding University, from Searcy, Arkansas. And he was presenting a lesson on the prophetic language of the day of the Lord in the Old Testament. And I was there with my good friend, William Bell, who, by the way, has a show here on Now Network on Saturday evenings. You need to tune into that to see William's excellent teaching. But William and I sat there and we listened. And this professor did a magnificent job of going to passage after passage after passage, demonstrating, as I've been doing, for you and with you, that this day of the Lord language is consistently metaphoric. He made the comment over and over again, this language was never intended to be taken literally. And he never made a single application of that principle with any New Testament prophecy. Well, William Bell and I sat there and we listened, and we would occasionally look at each other and raise our eyebrows like, wow, does this good brother not see the train coming? Does he not see the implication of his own comments? Well, when the lecture was over, the crowd kind of thinned out. I went up to him and I said, brother, I want you to know how much I appreciate your lesson today. And I said, because this is an area of fascination and a great deal of research on my own part. Now, mind you, at that time I had already written my book on 2 Peter 3. And had some pretty firm convictions on the matter. But I didn't want to come across too strongly. And so I said, I've been doing a great deal of research on this issue myself. And I said, now, I agree with you 100% that the Old Testament language of the day of the Lord was never intended to be taken literally. God never came visibly or bodily out of heaven in the Old Testament. But I said, here's my question to you. When we have a New Testament passage that is predicting the day of the Lord, and he quotes from Old Testament prophecies of the day of the Lord, prophecies that you and I admit utilize metaphoric language. And the New Testament writer never tells us, well, you know, it's metaphoric back in the Old Testament, but I'm changing the application to speak of a literal, physical day of the Lord. I said, what would be our hermeneutic for saying that although the New Testament writer is quoting from demonstrably metaphoric language from the Old Testament, that now he's interpreting it literally? And this good professor stood there totally silent. He was literally stunned. You've heard of that proverbial deer in the headlight look? Well, he had it. And finally he said, I don't have an answer for that. That is an excellent question. And he said, I'm going to have to go back. I'm going to have to do some research and study. I'm going to have to do some really serious thinking about this. And I said, well, I really, really appreciate your candor, your honesty. But I said, this to me is a really, really challenging question of hermeneutic. He said, I agree. He said, I've never given that a thought in my life. And he said, I don't have an answer for that as I stand here talking to you today. I said, well, I appreciate it. I said, I'd love to correspond with you about this. I'd love to have your thoughts on this further. Unfortunately, he never got a hold of me. And I lost his card. So I lost contact. But do you see the issue that is here? Do you see the issue of hermeneutic that is present? Do you see the challenge that this presents to us? I mean, it's much like saying, folks, that if we have a book on literature, by Chaucer, by Shakespeare, and what have you, and we understand the context, we understand the nature of that language that they are using, if we quote that language, are we going to expect our audience, number one, to expect or to understand how we're using it? Well, of course, if we're quoting it, they understand, they should understand, we're quoting it to apply it like they did. Or if we're going to say, well, Chaucer said this is how he applied it, but I'm just simply lifting a quote out of context, using it in a different way. Wouldn't we have to explain that we're using that quote in a different way? Of course we would. Now look, I've digressed a good bit here this morning, but this is so critical. You see, hermeneutic, the science of interpretation, lies as the foundation and as the source of everything that I am sharing with you here on Now TV. So, with that in mind, I want to share with you another Old Testament prophecy of the day of the Lord, in which the language of decreation is used, in which the language of the destruction of heaven and earth is used, and of God coming down out of heaven is used. And yet, it is all past tense. Okay, the passage is Psalms chapter 18. By the way, the parallel passage is 2 Samuel chapter 22. And notice the prelude, the introduction to the psalm. To the chief musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now, if you will remember the story of Saul and David, Saul became intensely jealous of David because, the women of Israel would sing a song. Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his 10,000s. And Saul well knew David was going to be king. So he saw him as a threat. And even though David, in playing the harp and playing the musical instruments, was very often a comfort to Saul, even though David had affirmed his loyalty to Saul on numerous occasions, even though he had fought for him, even though he had defended him, Saul was so blinded by jealousy. He sought to kill David. He chased David all over the territory of the land of Israel, trying to kill him. And if you remember the story, on one occasion, Saul has chased David, chased him off into the hills, and during the night, Saul has gone to his tent. There he's sleeping, and David slips into his tent. Now look, David could have killed him very easily. But David slipped into his tent, and he cut off a piece of his robe. And the very next morning, Saul comes out of his tent and he stretches and what have you. And David shouts down to him from a safe distance. And he acclaims and proclaims his loyalty and fealty to Saul as the king of Israel. And he says, oh, by the way, take a look at the corner of your robe. And take a look what I'm holding in my hand. I could have killed you, but I didn't, because I love you and because you are my king. You are the Lord's anointed. And Saul sort of kind of temporarily repented and proclaimed his love for David. But that was short-lived. And he began to try to kill him again. If you remember, on one occasion he took a javelin and threw it at David, attempting to kill him in a fit of jealousy, in a fit of rage. And so, once again, the historical context is Saul's attempt to kill David and to prevent David from becoming the king of Israel. But over and over and over, the Lord provided David deliverance and rescue by instructing him, well, go over here into the wilderness and Saul will not find you. Take refuge in the caves here and Saul will not find you. Once again, what is critical to understand here is that when one reads the story of the deliverance of David from Saul, there is not one, quote, miraculous event in the entire story. There is simply one event after another in which David escaped from Saul, in which the Lord instructed him, go over here, go over there, go over there. And yet, your assignment between now and next week is to read Psalms 18 and to see how David described God's deliverance for him. And we will discuss that at length next week. I'll see you there.